The quiet in the hospital chapel was a different kind of quiet. It was not the sterile, humming silence of the ICU, punctuated by the rhythmic sigh of a ventilator or the chirp of a heart monitor. This was a deep, weighted silence, thick with the ghosts of prayers spoken in desperation. The air smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint, lingering scent of lilies left on the small altar. For Nia, it was the only place in the sprawling Tokyo General Hospital where the noise in her head finally went quiet, too. Her body ached with a fatigue so profound it felt like it had settled into her bones. A 12-hour shift had bled into a 14-hour one after a multi-car pileup flooded the emergency room and sent a cascade of critical patients upstairs. Her dark green scrubs were rumpled, and she was sure a faint smudge of a patient's blood still stained the sleeve, a ghost of the frantic effort to save a life that had ultimately been lost. Her mind kept replaying the moment, the flatline tone that cut through the organized chaos, the resident calling time of death. It was a sound you never got used to. She sank onto one of the polished wooden pews, the cool wood a relief against her tired back. She didn't come here to pray. She came here for the absence of beeping, of hurried footsteps, of hushed, grim conversations. She leaned her head back, resting it against the wall, the smooth plaster cool against her neck. Her eyes drifted shut, just for a second. That was all she intended. 1 second of peace before she had to face the crowded train ride home to her tiny apartment. The next thing she knew, a presence had altered the room. It was not a sound that woke her, but a shift in the atmosphere. The weighted silence had become heavier, denser, charged. Nia's eyes snapped open. A man was sitting at the other end of her pew. He was not looking at her, but straight ahead at the simple stained glass window behind the altar, which depicted a bland, pastoral scene. He was immaculate. That was the first word that formed in her tired brain. His suit was a deep charcoal gray, tailored with such precision it seemed molded to the hard lines of his body. It was the kind of suit that cost more than her yearly salary, crafted from a fabric that absorbed the dim chapel light rather than reflecting it. A sliver of a crisp white shirt cuff was visible, anchored by a platinum cufflink that gleamed dully. His black hair was expertly cut, each strand in its place. He sat with a stillness that was absolute, a predator at rest. It was a posture of such profound authority that it seemed to bend the very air around him. She saw his hands, resting on his knees. They were large, elegant, with long fingers. And on the back of his left wrist, peeking out from beneath the expensive cuff, was the unmistakable, intricate pattern of dark ink. The tail of a dragon, its scales rendered in exquisite detail. Her breath caught in her throat. Yakuza. Here. In the quiet, sterile sanctuary of the hospital. Her exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling awareness that crawled up her spine. She had lived in Tokyo for 2 years, long enough to know what that ink signified. Long enough to know that men like him moved in a world of shadows and violence that never intersected with hers. Until now. She sat frozen, trying to make her breathing silent, shallow. She should get up. She should leave. But her limbs felt leaden, and some primal instinct screamed at her not to make any sudden movements. He finally turned his head. His gaze did not sweep the room. It moved with deliberate, unnerving slowness until it landed on her. His eyes were dark, almost black, and held a flat, unreadable expression. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. There was no warmth in them, no curiosity. Only assessment. He took in her rumpled scrubs, the exhaustion she knew was plain on her face, the way she was now sitting ramrod straight. A flicker of something amusement? Annoyance? Passed through their depths before vanishing. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, a face that looked as if it had been carved from stone. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, the only imperfection on an otherwise flawless, severe canvas. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. He did not speak. He just watched her, and Nia felt pinned by his gaze, like a specimen under glass. The air grew thick, heavy with everything he was not saying. She could feel the power radiating from him, a palpable force field of quiet menace. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, smooth baritone, with a gravelly edge that seemed to come from the very depths of his chest. It was quiet, but it filled the entire chapel. "You should be more careful where you fall asleep," he said, his English perfect, without a trace of an accent. "This is not a safe place for dreaming." Nia's heart hammered against her ribs. He was not warning her about the general dangers of a city hospital. He was the danger. The warning was himself. She finally found her voice, though it came out as a strained whisper. "I'm a nurse here. I was just resting my eyes." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. His eyes flickered down to the faded hospital ID clipped to her scrub top. Nia Williams, RN. He read her name, and the simple act felt like a violation, like he was cataloging a piece of property. "Nurse Williams," he said, tasting the name. He said it differently than anyone else. Not with the professional briskness of the doctors or the friendly familiarity of her colleagues. He said it like it was an object he had just picked up, testing its weight. "Your shift is over." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that sent another chill through her. How did he know that? Had he been sitting there, watching her sleep, for that long? The thought was deeply unsettling. "I have to go," she managed, her body finally obeying her command to move. She started to slide toward the edge of the pew, her muscles stiff. "Wait," he said. The single word was not a request. It was an order, soft but absolute, and it stopped her cold. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He didn't offer it to her. He placed it deliberately on the polished wood of the pew between them. "Room 418. In the private wing," he said, his eyes locking with hers again. "My brother is the patient there. His name on the chart is Saito. He will require attentive care, the kind that does not ask questions." Nia stared at the folded paper, then back at him. The private wing was for the wealthy, the powerful, the ones who demanded discretion. She wasn't assigned there. "I work in the cardiac ICU," she said, her voice steadier now. Professionalism was a shield, and she grasped for it. "I don't have clearance for the private wing." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it held no humor. It was a cold, sharp thing. "You do now," he said. "I am told you are the best, that you notice things others do not. Prove them right." He stood then, a fluid, economical movement that spoke of contained power. He was taller than she'd realized, broad-shouldered, casting a long shadow in the dim light. The scent of him reached her, sandalwood and something clean, like cold rain on stone. It was a scent as expensive and intimidating as his suit. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the chapel, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. He moved like the world was built to get out of his way. Nia sat there, her heart a frantic drum in the sudden, echoing silence. The air still vibrated with his presence. Her eyes fell to the folded paper on the pew. Her training, her instincts, her common sense, everything screamed at her to leave it, to walk away and pretend this encounter never happened. But she didn't. Her hand moved as if of its own accord, her fingers closing around the crisp paper. It felt heavy in her palm, heavy with a choice she hadn't asked for, a choice that had already been made for her. That was the moment her ordinary world fractured, the clean, orderly lines of her life blurring into something dangerous and unknown. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, a memo from the director of nursing was waiting in her locker. Effective immediately, she was reassigned to the VIP private wing, citing her exemplary record in critical care. It was seamless, efficient, and terrifying. There was no trace of the man from the chapel, only the smooth, unnerving execution of his will. His name was Kaito Tanaka, she learned from the hushed whispers of the other nurses. Head of the Tanakagumi, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence. Room 418 was more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital room. A young man, who looked to be a younger version of Kaito, lay in the bed. His name on the chart was Haru Saito, but Nia knew his real name was Akio Tanaka. He was unconscious, hooked up to a web of monitors, a bandage stark white against the side of his abdomen.
Gunshot wound, the chart said.
Complications from surgery.
Sepsis.
He was critical. And Kaito was there. He sat in a leather armchair in the corner, a silent sentinel. He wore another perfectly tailored suit, this one the color of midnight. He didn't acknowledge her when she entered, but she felt his eyes on her, tracking her every move as she checked the 4 lines, monitored the vitals, and made notes on the chart. She worked with practiced, professional calm, her hands steady, her focus absolute. It was the only armor she had. For days, this became their silent routine. Nia would arrive for her shift, and Kaito would be there. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to ask a clipped, precise question about his brother's condition. He never ate, never seemed to sleep. He just watched. He watched his brother, and he watched her. Nia learned the rhythm of his stillness, the subtle tension in his jaw that meant Akio's blood pressure was dropping, the way his fingers would clench when his brother's breathing hitched. In those long, quiet hours, she saw the crack in his granite facade. It was in the way he looked at his brother, a raw, aching grief and a profound, suffocating guilt. This was his wound, the shame he carried. He had failed to protect the one person who mattered. She saw it, and she knew he knew she saw it. It created a strange, unspoken intimacy in the sterile room. The danger arrived on a Tuesday. It came in the form of a new janitor, a man whose smile was too wide, whose movements were too stiff. He was mopping the hallway outside room 418, but his eyes kept flicking to the door. Nia, on her way to the supply closet, felt that familiar prickle of unease. His uniform was clean, too clean. His hands, gripping the mop handle, were calloused in a way that didn't speak of janitorial work. They were the hands of a fighter. She paused, pretending to check her phone. The man started moving toward the door of 418, a syringe glinting in the hand hidden by his cart. Her blood ran cold. She didn't think. She acted. Dropping her phone with a clatter, she let out a sharp cry. "Oh, no," she exclaimed, bending to retrieve it. As she came up, she accidentally stumbled, knocking over a tray of medical supplies on a nearby cart. Vials and instruments crashed to the floor with a deafening noise. Nurses and a security guard came running. The janitor froze, his cover blown. His eyes met Nia's for a split second, and they were filled with cold fury. He abandoned his cart and bolted in the opposite direction. The commotion brought Kaito out of the room, his face a mask of thunder. His men, disguised as visitors, materialized out of nowhere, securing the hallway with lethal efficiency. Kaito's gaze found Nia amidst the chaos. She was on the floor, picking up scattered supplies, her hands trembling slightly. She had a choice. She could have kept walking. She could have pretended she saw nothing. But she hadn't. Later, after the hospital security had been placated with a story about a disgruntled former employee and the ward was quiet again, Kaito cornered her in the linen closet. He moved so silently, she didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone, the next the door clicked shut and he was there, filling the small space, blocking the only exit. The air thickened, smelling of antiseptic and his cold, rain-on-stone cologne. "You saw him," he stated, his voice dangerously low. She nodded, her throat tight. His hands weren't right, and he was watching the door. He stepped closer, his body heat a tangible presence. He was so close she could see the fine threads in his silk tie, the tiny scar bisecting his eyebrow. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for something she couldn't name. "You made a choice," he said. "You could have walked away." "He was going to kill your brother," she said simply. "I'm a nurse. My job is to keep my patients alive." "That is your job," he conceded, his gaze intense. "It is not your job to put yourself in the path of a man like that for a patient you know is not who his chart says he is." He lifted a hand, and for a terrifying second, she thought he might strike her. Instead, his fingers brushed a stray curl from her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle, yet possessive. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, a confusing mix of fear and something else, something warm and liquid. "You are more trouble than I anticipated, Nurse Williams," he murmured, his thumb grazing her jawline. The silence that followed was charged, electric. It was the first moment of genuine connection between them, forged not in comfort, but in shared danger. A silent acknowledgement that she had crossed a line, and in doing so, had bound herself to him in a way she could not yet comprehend. From that day on, everything changed. Kaito no longer viewed her as just a competent nurse. He saw her as an asset, a complication, and most dangerously, as a responsibility. The rival clan, the Ichikawakai, now knew a foreign nurse had thwarted their attempt on Akio's life. She was no longer an anonymous face in a hospital. She was a witness, a target. 2 days after the incident, as she was leaving her apartment for her shift, 2 of Kaito's men were waiting for her in a black sedan. They were polite, but unyielding. "Tanaka-san insists," was all they said. Her protest died in her throat. She knew it wasn't a request. She was taken not to the hospital, but to a sleek, modern penthouse apartment in Shinjuku that overlooked the entire city. "Your new home," one of the men said, placing her hastily packed bag on the marble floor of the foyer. "For your protection." The apartment was beautiful, sterile, and a prison. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a glittering, indifferent Tokyo. The furniture was minimalist and expensive. There was no clutter, no personal touches. It was a place for someone to exist, not to live. And Kaito was there, standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "This is unnecessary," Nia said, her voice tight with anger and fear. "You can't just kidnap me." He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "The Ichikawakai do not leave loose ends. Your apartment is being watched. Your life, the one you knew, is over for now. This is not a punishment. It is a necessity." Her anger deflated, replaced by a cold dread. He was right. She had seen the face of the man in the hospital. She was a liability. He was not imprisoning her. He was protecting his investment. And what had she become, if not that? The days that followed were a strange limbo. A private car took her to and from the hospital. His men were her constant shadows. In the apartment, she was alone with him. They rarely spoke, coexisting in the vast, silent space. She would read or watch the city lights, and he would work, taking quiet, menacing phone calls in Japanese. But the tension between them was a living thing, a constant hum beneath the surface. She found herself watching him. The way he moved, the way the light caught the silver in his hair at the temples, the deep concentration on his face as he reviewed documents. He was a creature of immense discipline and lethal grace. One evening, he was late returning from whatever dark business occupied his nights. She heard the commotion in the private elevator, then the apartment door opened. He stumbled in, leaning heavily against the wall. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt was torn at the shoulder, and a dark, wet stain was spreading across his side. He looked up and saw her standing there, his eyes clouded with pain and fury. Behind him, one of his men bowed low. "My apologies," the man said. There was an ambush. Kaito waved him away, and the door clicked shut. They were alone. "You need a doctor," Nia said, her nursing instincts overriding her fear. "No doctors," he gritted out, pushing himself off the wall. "No hospitals." He swayed, and she moved without thinking, catching his arm to steady him. He was heavy, solid muscle, and he smelled of gunpowder, iron, and the night air. The wound was a deep gash along his ribs, bleeding sluggishly. A knife wound. "It needs stitches," she said, her voice firm. "I can do it, but I need supplies." He just stared at her, his breathing harsh. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of vulnerability, a crack in the armor that he allowed no one to see. It was a look of raw, animal pain. He gave a sharp nod. She had been smart. The day she realized her life was no longer her own, she had started smuggling small things from the hospital supply closet: sutures, antiseptic wipes, sterile gauze, lidocaine. It was a risk, A clear violation of every rule, a moral line she never thought she'd cross. But some part of her had known this moment was coming. She led him to the large, marble-tiled bathroom and had him sit on the edge of the tub. She retrieved her hidden kit from her bag. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but efficient. He never flinched, but his muscles were coiled tight beneath her fingers. The silence was thick with the sound of his ragged breaths and the small, clinical noises of her work. She injected the lidocaine to numb the area, then began to stitch the ragged edges of his skin together. Her face was close to his, her focus absolute. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the pulse beating in the strong column of his throat. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her hands. "Why what?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Why do you do this? Why did you help in the hospital? Why are you not screaming now?" She finished a stitch, pulling it taut before snipping the thread. She finally met his gaze. His dark eyes were burning with an intensity that stole her breath. "I told you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm a nurse. I fix what's broken." He let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "I am not broken. I am what I am." "You're bleeding," she countered softly. "Everyone's the same when they're bleeding." He reached up, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was no longer just possessive, it was something more complex, something that felt dangerously like reverence. "No one looks at me the way you do," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "They see a monster, a title, a weapon. You look at me and you see a man who is bleeding." It was a confession, more intimate than any declaration of love. It was an admission of the humanity he kept buried so deep. In that moment, the line between captor and captive, patient and nurse, monster and man, blurred into nothing. She was no longer just surviving. She was staying. And she was terrified of what that meant. The truce Kaido had brokered after the ambush was fragile. The Ichikawakai had been bloodied, but not broken. They retreated into the shadows, and an unnerving quiet settled over their lives. Akio was slowly recovering, moved from the hospital to a private medical facility owned by the Tanakagumi. Nia's life continued in its gilded cage, a strange domesticity settling between her and Kaido. They ate meals together in silence, the unspoken tension a constant third guest at the table. Then the enemy made their move, and this time it was personal. They didn't come for Kaido with guns or knives. They came for Nia with information. Kaido was out for the evening, a rare occurrence. Nia was on the balcony, watching the river of headlights flowing through the city, when her personal phone, which she hadn't used in weeks, buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It was a photo, a candid shot of a woman with a bright, easy smile, her arm linked with a man's as they walked out of a coffee shop. The woman was her older sister, Maya. The text below it read, "She has your smile. It would be a shame to ruin it."
Ginza, midnight. Come alone.
Ice flooded Nia's veins. Maya lived in Chicago. She was a graphic designer, happily married, completely removed from the life Nia had fallen into. How had they found her? The message was clear. They weren't just targeting Nia anymore. They were trying to rip away the last piece of her old life, to use the person she loved most as bait. She knew it was a trap. A stupid, obvious trap designed to lure her out and, through her, get to Kaido. But the image of Maya's smiling face, so carefree and unaware, shattered her composure. This was her fault. Her association with Kaido had painted a target on her sister's back, an ocean away. When Kaido returned, he found her pacing the living room, her phone clutched in her hand. She showed him the message. The change in him was terrifying. The cold, controlled calm vanished, replaced by a stillness so absolute it was more frightening than any rage. It was the stillness of a predator that has caught the scent of its prey. "They did not touch her," he said, his voice lethally soft. "This photo is old. They are watching her, but they have not touched her. It is a bluff." "How can you be sure?" Nia demanded, her voice shaking. Because if they had laid a single hand on your family, the man who sent this message would already be begging me for a death that I would not grant him, he replied, his eyes like black ice. He took the phone from her hand.
This is not about her. It's about you.
They want to draw you out. They know you are my weakness. He said the word as if it tasted like poison. He had never admitted to such a thing. It hung in the air between them, a stark and dangerous truth. We are not going to Ginza, he said, his tone final. We can't just do nothing, she cried. They're threatening my sister. Doing nothing is not the plan, he said, already moving toward his office. The plan is to end this. Tonight. Nia followed him. I'm going with you. No, the word was flat, absolute. You said it yourself, Kaido.
They want me.
They'll be expecting me to be the bait. But they won't be expecting me to be part of the trap, she argued, her mind racing. She was no longer a passive victim. She had stitched his wounds, lived in his world, breathed its dangerous air.
She was part of this now.
I was a nurse. I can play the part. I can get close. You need me. He stopped and turned to face her. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching and intense. He saw not hysteria, but a cold, determined resolve that mirrored his own. He had tried to protect her by caging her, but he had only succeeded in sharpening her. He gave a single, sharp nod. The plan was audacious. They would meet in Ginza. They would intercept the Ichikawa lieutenant who had sent the message at his own safe house. Kaido's network was ruthlessly efficient. They had the location within the hour. Nia's role was critical. She would be the diversion. Dressed as a paramedic responding to a fake emergency call they would place, she would get past the outer security and create an opening. As they stood in the sterile garage beneath the penthouse, surrounded by a silent, black-suited men, Kaido stopped her before she got in the car. He adjusted the collar of the paramedic uniform she wore. His fingers were firm against her throat. When I give the signal, you get down, and you do not move until I come for you, he commanded, his eyes boring into hers. Do you understand? I understand, she said, her own gaze unwavering. The raid was a blur of controlled violence. Nia's heart pounded, but her mind was sharp, her movements precise as she played her part, shouting medical terms as she and one of Kaido's men, also in uniform, pushed a gurney toward the building. The guards, confused by the sudden medical emergency, were taken down with brutal, silenced efficiency. She created the opening. Inside, the lieutenant was waiting, and the trap was sprung. The fight was short, swift, and lethal. Nia saw Kaido move not like a man, but like a force of nature, a whirlwind of calculated violence. He was terrifying. He was magnificent. In the end, the lieutenant was on his knees before Kaido, bleeding and defeated. Kaido looked at Nia, who stood by the door, her face pale but her expression resolute. He didn't have to give an order. He didn't have to say a word. The threat to her family was neutralized, permanently. The cost was her innocence, a final severing from the woman she used to be. She had not pulled a trigger, but she had been the key that unlocked the door to this bloodshed. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Back in the penthouse, the silence was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, raw finality. The city lights glittered below, oblivious. Nia stood by the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Her old life was not just gone. It felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. Kaido came to stand behind her. She could feel his presence, a solid wall of heat and power. He didn't touch her, but his voice was close to her ear, a low murmur. My contacts in the States have confirmed it, he said. The surveillance on your sister is gone. They are safe. They will never be touched. She nodded, unable to speak. He placed a hand on her shoulder, turning her to face him. He looked down at her, and for the first time, his eyes were stripped of all their guards, all their cold calculation. They were filled with a fierce, possessive darkness that was almost tender. I told you once that you were my weakness, he said, his voice rough. I was wrong. You are not my weakness. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. You are my reason. It was not a declaration of love. It was something deeper, something forged in blood and fear and a terrible, unbreakable bond. It was an acknowledgement of what she had become to him, the single fixed point in his violent, spinning world. He didn't need to say more. She didn't need to hear it. This was their truth, born in a silent chapel and sealed in a night of violence. Her choice had been made long ago, in a linen closet with a needle and thread in her hand. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a claim, a brand, a promise of a dangerous and uncertain future. It tasted of whiskey, and shadows, and forever. And she did not pull away. She leaned into him, surrendering to the inevitable, to the man who had become her captor, her protector, her fate. Outside, the city of Tokyo sprawled into the darkness, a kingdom of light and shadow. And in the glass of the window, she could see their reflection, two figures entwined, two worlds collided, two souls irrevocably bound. This was her life now, and she was finally ready to live it.